Hello, this session is going to be about realism. So I'm going to go ahead, share my screen, and we will get started. Okay, so before we can dive into realism, I need to give you a bit of background. So last we talked, or I talked at you really, I talked about neoclassicism and romanticism. Okay, so if you think of neoclassicism, remember how it was a return to the values of antiquity, and you had Napoleon, and then eventually Napoleon is exiled, as I mentioned. So in 1814, Napoleon abdicates. And so he helped to overthrow the king, right? There was a reign of terror in 1793 to 94, and like thousands of people were beheaded. So it was a very tumultuous time. And then Napoleon is made the emperor, and then he basically becomes a dictator. So in 1814, he is forced to abdicate. And so at this time, Europe as a whole, but also France, is just a hot mess. So France is returned to pre-Napoleon borders and governments, so the borders from 1791. And this is because a Congress had met to redraw boundaries of countries. Okay, so, and during this time, we have Louis the 18th on the throne, and he dies in 1824, and his brother takes the throne. His brother is Charles the 10th. It looks like Charles X if you ever see it written. And he puts a couple of rules in place. First of all, he has the death penalty for anyone profaning the Eucharist. So, what this means is communion, which is the act of consuming wine and wafers that are symbolic, and they stand in for the body and the blood of Christ, right? So at the Last Supper, Jesus took bread and he said, "Eat this, this is my flesh." And he took wine and he said, "Drink this, this is my blood." And so it is a spiritual recreation of that event. And the Eucharist is the wafers and the drink, which are seen as being transformed by the priests into the actual blood and flesh of Jesus Christ. So, what Charles X is saying is that if anyone sasses the communion, they can be put to death. Okay, so that's really severe. And it's not doing much for religious freedom. Okay, he also is uh, putting things right with the land that was taken by the revolutionaries in the French Revolution and returning it to people, paying people who were declared enemies of the revolution, right? So people who had stuck with the king, loyalists. He did propose tighter censorship as well, but this was shot down. And then he dissolved Parliament, and it took 2 months to get it back up. And he dissolves the National Guard of Paris as well, which serves as kind of a mediator between citizens and the monarchy. So, July 25th, 1830, he signs the July Ordinances, which suspend the liberty of press, and they exclude the commercial middle class from future elections, as well as dissolve the Chamber of Deputies. So he's doing everything that he can to make the government really focused on the aristocracy and royalty, and he's trying to exclude the middle and lower classes. So on July 26th, so this is the day after he signs these ordinances, the middle class shuts down factories to protest not being included in future elections, and then unemployment spikes because they're turned into the streets, the workers. The 27th, the revolution begins and riots start. They face off the military. 21 civilians are killed. This continues through the 28th, and on the 29th, some of the palaces are sacked. And politicians go ahead and establish a provisional government. So on August 2nd, he abdicates. Charles X abdicates. So he steps down from the throne and he heads to the UK. Louis Philippe is placed on the throne, and he agrees to rule as a constitutional monarch. So this means that he is not an absolute monarch. He can't do whatever he wants, right? There are bodies in place to keep him from just going hog wild. And he's referred to as Citizen King and King of the French rather than the King of France. So semantics. And unfortunately, under his rule, conditions for the working class deteriorate further and the income gap widens. Okay, so what you see here is Delacroix, who's romantic. You see Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, July 28th, 1830. And so he is advocating for this uprising against the government. And you can see here that this is a personification of liberty, of France. She's carrying the French flag. And behind her, there are everyday people following her. And so you can see that this is really elevating the status of the revolutionaries. Now, unfortunately, Louis Philippe does not do well. He funds the government by taxing the poor, and he actually is the subject of this cartoon by Daumier. And this is called Gargantua. And this was made during the rule of Louis Philippe. And so what you see here, it might not read particularly well, but you have all these poor people on the right who are putting money into a basket. And then these baskets are taken up into the mouth of the king, right? Louis Philippe, who is overweight. He's massive. He's much, much bigger. And then all the money goes into his gullet and he poops out edicts. Okay, so this is not a flattering portrayal of Louis Philippe. And for creating this, Daumier is sentenced to 6 months in prison just for making this. Okay, so remember the freedom of the press has been suspended in the past, so things are not looking very good. In 1848, Louis Philippe is finally overthrown and an elected government is instituted, but they have continuing issues with unemployment. Things come to a head when workshops for unemployed are canceled and the people who don't have jobs are told, join the army or go home. And this leads to riots. Over 10,000 people are killed or injured, 4,000 are deported to Africa, etc. So it's after this that we start to see workers becoming the dominant image in realist art. And I'll get into what that means in just a moment. So what we're talking about today is called realism. And realism is this idea, let me find a good piece while I give you just like a little bit of background. Realism is this idea that what is being depicted are everyday people. So this is not that the painting is done in a realistic way. It's depicting reality. Okay, so there's a big difference there between realistic and realism. So the term realism is applied in the 1830s and widely used before 1848. And so what we're going to see are images of peasants that are not artificial like the salon paintings of the time or the academic style paintings. So when I say the salon, the French had a salon, if you'll remember, that moderated painting and art. And they decided who could be an artist and who couldn't, what types of things were acceptable to be shown. And the reason that this is important or even relevant in the time is because if you were an artist, the way that you would sell your art is to go ahead and submit it to the academy. And then every year they would hold a salon. And so what this means is that all the art that was submitted would be put on display and you would have walls just absolutely stacked with art, just massive quantities. And people would crowd in and it would be incredibly hot and close and everyone would get to see this art. And this was how you sold art. So if you did not follow the rules of the salon, of the academy, your art would not be displayed and you would not be able to sell it. Okay, so this is pretty serious. And so we're going to see a couple of characteristics of realist art. So these are generally somewhat spontaneous images. The paint application is rough rather than very smooth, and there's a lack of sentimentality. So these people, as I mentioned, are being portrayed as they actually appeared. So you're not aggrandizing or romanticizing their lot in life. Okay, so 1840s to 1850s, the term realism is being used as a criticism. So in 1855, Courbet puts together his own exhibition in the Pavillon du Réalisme in Paris. So this is work that had been rejected from the official salon. And this is revolutionary, right? This is completely circumventing all the ways that people knew to display and sell art. And so Courbet publishes a book, and he is advocating for painting non-symbolic things in themselves rather than ideas. So we're not going to see lofty ideals being portrayed. We're going to see things as they are. Okay. Um, so in this work, which is The Stonebreakers by Courbet, what we see here, and this work was destroyed during World War II, which is why this image is so poor. But what we see here is a massive painting. Okay, so these individuals are life size. And what you're seeing are people breaking large stones into smaller stones that can be used for paving, etc. So think about the work that it would require in order to break down a large stone into the smaller stones here. Okay, so this is physical work. This is hard. This is not a desirable position. This is back-breaking labor, and you can see that these people are poor. Look how patched these pants are. His shirt is ripped, his vest is ripped. Okay, and think of how physically taxing it would be to use the pickaxe to break these stones and then to gather the stones and put them into baskets and carry them, all for very little money. Okay, and so with this image, Courbet is indicating that um, these figures are condemned to this life. They have no other options. So this is the first work to really show the tedium and dehumanizing hardship of manual labor. This is not some romanticized, timeless landscape, right, with people working in it. This is cropped. Their faces are obscured. They're no more important than the landscape that they're in. And so by hiding their faces, Courbet is indicating that these figures are anonymous and they have no hope of leaving this life. Okay. And so Courbet is interested in the social reality of one's time. Okay. And so he is, this is one work for which he's really well known, but he has other works. And you can see that this is stone breaking as it is practiced today. So these are child laborers breaking stones in Africa. So this is published in 2006 in the New York Times. Okay, so Courbet is known for a few different works. So this is the burial at Ornans. And what we see here is a funeral. And the grave is depicted in the very front, and you can see the mourners surrounding the grave. But this is not, these are not aggrandizing these villagers, right? These are not super wealthy, fancy people. Their clothing is very severe and austere, right? These faces are very personalized, individualized. And the viewer is put into the grave by the location of where the viewer would stand and where the grave is. Okay, so this is from 1849 to 1850, and this is again massive. It is life size. So prior to this, we have seen very large canvases, but these canvases are typically considered grand manner. So the grand manner is something that drew on artistic and Renaissance themes, or art, and it emphasizes humanism. So the themes of humanism in classical forms. It's taught by the official academies, and so think about a really, really big canvas that has life-size people on it. Right? You would typically want to portray something very noble, right? Something that would invigorate you, something moralizing, perhaps, and you would also be spending a lot of energy, a lot of time on this, as well as the cost of materials. Okay, so making one of these is a big undertaking, and it's reserved solely for these history paintings, these grand paintings. And so what we're seeing here is that Courbet is taking everyday subject matter and he is elevating it to the level of a grand manner history painting. I am sorry, my cat just got on my keyboard. Um, okay, so you can see how this would be very, very different. Okay, and some of his other works include this is the artist's studio. And so here in the center, we see Courbet, and he is surrounded by people who have come to his studio to purchase works, as well as a model here, and they all look at him in adoration. And this is from 1854 to 55, and once again, massive, over life-size figures. And you can see that he is really aggrandizing or emphasizing the role of the artist here. And everyone is looking to the artist to lead them, to teach them, right? And so we really see this emphasis on the artist as creative genius. Okay. And this is an outgrowth of Romanticism because remember how the artist was responsible for playing a central role in the depiction of the work, and mankind was small, right? This is an outgrowth of that. But this is not focused on the imagination or aggrandizing nature or visionary works like William Blake. This is the hard, cold facts of everyday life. Okay, and Courbet is known for, right, these kind of dark colors. He would also use his palette knife to apply paint, which is very different from the way that paint was being applied by artists in the academy. Okay, so this is another work, and you can see how sketchy the paint application is here. This is a self-portrait, and he is assuming the guise of someone being driven mad by fear, but you can see how rough the paint application really is, and that this is not something that is highly polished and smoothed over. This is not the impasto of the Baroque era either. This is very rough, very raw. And so another self-portrait, and the next image is pretty explicit, but it's important. So this is the origin of the world, or l'origine du monde. And so what we see here is a deliberately pornographic image. Okay, so look at this composition. It is, it was painted for, I believe, a sheik, and he would keep it in a room with other pornographic images, and this is where he would go to view porn, basically. But look at what is depicted. We see these legs that are just chopped off. And then the genitalia is not presented in a particularly appealing way, but very natural. And only one breast is visible, it's cropped, it's a very odd angle. And so what is important here is to think about the nudes that we have seen before. Okay, so this is an artist who's working at the same time as Courbet, and this is Bouguereau. And he is known for his academic style paintings and how, sorry, I thought I had another one, how smooth and seductive and appealing his nudes are. And so if you look, you can see you can't really see any pubic hair. You're not seeing genitalia. You're seeing these very alluring and titillating females. And this is intentional. These are very beautiful, smooth bodies. And so realism is not that. Realism is real women with cellulite and, uh, back fat, etc. And this is another work by Courbet, and this is called The Bathers. And you can see here that this is a very sturdy woman. You can see that she has quite thick knees. She looks like she's very strong, and she's not idealized in any way. Okay, so this is a huge break from the past when you would be depicting very beautiful, idealized females as nudes. And so this is not something that is being presented for pure visual pleasure, right? This is a much more realistic depiction of everyday life, of everyday women. And so how this work is received depends a lot on who is seeing it. So this is an attempt to make work accessible to all classes. And so obviously not all classes will be able to afford one of these massive paintings by Courbet. But we're going to see some more art that would be more financially accessible, but something that speaks to all classes, or at least the lower classes. But this is seen as very revolutionary and potentially problematic by the upper classes, right? So at this time, you have these uprisings of peasants and the lower classes and factory workers, and you don't want to think about what their life is like, how unhappy they might be. You are heavily invested, if you're a member of the aristocracy or the higher classes, you are heavily invested in making sure that you are maintaining like this fiction of they want to be doing this. It's their role in life. They can't do anything else. Okay. So if you are one of the upper classes, you can see where this would be very revolutionary and problematic. Okay, so here we see another academic style painting, and this is Sappho. And you can see that she is very smooth and seductive and sensual and erotic. And her, her muscles, there's no cellulite here, nothing. Whereas if you look here, you can see the cellulite on the back of her leg. Okay, and so we're not going to see these higher, more intellectual subject matter of the Greek, I believe Greek, poetess, right? Going to bed. We're not going to see any of that. We're going to see everyday people. And so this was seen as scary by the upper classes. Okay, so this is another one. It's called The Winnowers or the Grain Sifters. And this is Courbet from 1865. And so let me come back to this one. This is The Gleaners by Millet. Okay, and so we can see that there's a lot going on here. Okay, so formally, right, we have these figures who mimic these forms in the background. The colors are harmonious. They have these same sort of rounded forms. But what do you think we're looking at? We are looking at peasants, women, and they are engaged in picking up leftover wheat. Okay, so a few things that I really want to point out about this work. The first of the points that I want to make is look how dark their skin is. Okay, so this is someone who spends a lot of time outside in the sun. And nowadays we see a tan as being desirable and attractive. But in those days, you would only have a tan if you had to be outside. So if you are a peasant and you're forced to work outside, you would be tan. If you are able to spend time indoors and you don't have to work outside, you're pale. Okay, and paleness was very desirable because it was a status marker. It showed where you stood in society. Okay, So these are someone's who work outside, okay, on the regular. Now, what we're seeing here is not women going through and harvesting grain. Okay, so this would be easier if I could demonstrate, but basically you would have a scythe, which is a rounded blade, and you would swing it like this, and it's very heavy, and it would cut the wheat towards the bottom of the stalk. And then someone would come along and gather up this wheat and bundle it. And so what we see here in the background are piles of wheat. Now, some of the wheat would fall, right? I mean, that just makes sense. You wouldn't be able to get all the stalks. And so these stalks would be left in the fields, and the incredibly poor would come along and pick these up. Okay, so think about all the wheat that it would take to make bread. Okay, so you have a stalk of wheat, and you have, the seeds, which are about like that. You have maybe 10 or 15 on one stalk. So that's your head of wheat. Look at how much wheat these women are holding. Okay, look at that. They have a handful. That's it. Think about how much wheat this, how much flour this wheat would make. This is nothing. And they are picking up literally individual stalks of wheat. Okay, and look at their positions. They are bent over. This is back-breaking labor, like almost literally back-breaking, for very little return. These are incredibly poor people. Okay, they are engaged in this just to try to scrape a little bit of flour to feed their families. This is really, really extreme. And so what we don't see here is the happy peasant, happy in their lot in life. And there are others who portrayed peasants at the time in a more sentimental manner, right? So here we see, this is another realist painter, but it's much more the upright peasant who is silhouetted against the sky, right? We're not seeing this back-breaking labor that would go into this. Okay, so I want you to envision having to do this all day just to get enough for maybe a couple of loaves of bread. Think about how exhausting that is. And these women are being presented without commentary. There's no, they're just being brought to your attention and placed there. So this is 1857, and you can see how this is incredibly revolutionary. I actually have this hanging above my desk. And so whenever I start to feel upset about work, I look up and I realize I have it so much better than so many people. And it really helps me adjust my perspective. I, I really am struggling to explain to you how horrendous this would be to have to do this. Okay. And so what we see here is this attempt to create an objective representation of the external world based on observation. Okay, and so this is not some grand subject matter. This is not the loves of the gods of the Rococo. This is not an historical painting of some great warrior. This is everyday life. This is the truth of reality. Okay. And they, the realists see themselves as a mirror of reality. And it's not sentimental, it is objective. I just, this work just is so powerful to my mind. So powerful. And it's huge, it's massive. So I just really want you to comprehend how different this is. Okay, so we've been looking at the French Baroque, which was 2 lectures or 2 classes ago, I should say, right? And we saw this individual who is pale. One of you mentioned that in your reading questions because he doesn't have to spend time in the sun, even though he is the Sun King. And he's dressed well and he is upright. And this is also a massive picture. But think about the mind shift that's required to go from Louis, the Sun King, to peasants engaged in picking up individual stalks of wheat. Okay, this is exhausting. And so this is Bouguereau again, who is again an academic painter. And I just want to show you how peasants are portrayed, right? So they may be portrayed as somewhat pitiful, right? But it's very sentimental. This is someone that you want to help, right? This is basically the concept of the deserving poor without having to see what the poor really go through. Okay. Again, this is Malay, and it seems kind of sentimental because they're praying, but this is actually something that Malay witnessed in his family as he was growing up. And so what you have here are devout Catholics who the bells ring and they indicate that it's a certain time of day when you are supposed to recite a certain prayer. And so we see here their religion, excuse me, after I'm not sure if it's sunrise or sunset. But either way, you're looking at a long day of hard labor and they're stopping, they're praying. Um, Again, right? So this very physical labor, this very rough, raw, there's a very raw quality to these works. This sheep is being sheared, it's not being slaughtered. But again, this is not refined, this is not smooth. This is very rough and raw. Okay, so again, this is another academic painting of a peasant. And you can tell that she's poor based on her clothing and her headscarf, right? But it's very sentimental and it's beautiful. These are not dirty. It's affectionate, okay? Very different. So this is the winnower, which is very similar to the courbet that I said that I would come back to. So now that you have kind of gotten the process for harvesting wheat, what you're seeing here is another backbreaking part of getting the wheat. So let me just Google stalk of wheat. Okay, just so you can kind of see what we're looking at here. All right. So this is a stalk of wheat, and each of these little things is a seed. Okay, but this is, it's about like this big, the wheat bit. And so in order to get the grains out, what you would do is you would put these on the floor and you would kind of flatten it out and then you would beat them. And this would release the grains from these little containers, these little pods. And then what you have to do is winnowing. So this is taking what's on the floor, right? So you get rid of the stalks, but then you're left with the broken open pods and the grains. And you put it in a basket and you kind of toss it. And this lets the pods go up in the air and then they can kind of float away and the grain falls down. So this is how you separate them. Again, this entire process is backbreaking. Okay, and so we're seeing these depictions, right? Here is the winnowers at the grain sifters, and you can see how exhausted they are. Think about the amount of arm strength that it would require in order to lift all this grain and chaff and throw it. Okay, it's a lot of work. All right, so this is Malay. Okay, we've looked at Courbet as well. Again, just to show you what the officially accepted style is and how peasants are supposed to be portrayed. Okay, so Manet. So Manet is an interesting person who kind of bridges realism and impressionism. And what he does is he uses everyday modern people to as subjects to create a dialogue with art of the past. Okay, and so he focuses on seeing rather than literary imagination, and he's depicting the bourgeois. So these are people who have some money, but they're not the aristocracy, right? And so we're seeing new consumerism, ready to wear fashions. So fashion is a really big deal at this time. It's blurring the lines between classes. You're no longer making your own clothing necessarily. You can go and buy it. And so this work that we're looking at is from 1863, and it's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Luncheon on the Grass. And so what we see here are two men who have some amount of wealth, and they are picnicking with two women who are prostitutes. And so what we see is a very nice still life here in the corner. And then you have these men sitting, and you have this nude woman. And you can see that she is not an idealized nude woman. Okay, she has some tummy rolls, right? She's not perfect, but she's also somewhat alarming. You can see that she really doesn't have nipples. Um, and so this image of wealthy men and just a prostitute sitting with them is very offensive at this time. And again, this is a very large picture. And so it's very unsettling, and it reveals probably too much about these classes to themselves. Okay. Uh, and so this is a very famous work. Again, this is how we see nudes depicted at this time. So this is 1863. This is 1863. Okay. So very seductive, smooth flesh that you just kind of want to. Um, it looks like marble. It looks very tactile. You want to touch it. And then we have Olympia. So this is an incredibly famous work by Monet from 1863. And so what we see here is actually the same woman who's depicted as the prostitute. And the name Olympia is actually a common term for a high class prostitute of the time. And so what we see is this prostitute lounging on her bed, and she's completely nude except for some jewelry and her slipper, which is dangling off her foot. And we see her maid bringing her flowers from an admirer. Okay, but a few things here that make this very different from other works that are a somewhat similar image. Okay, so here we see the Venus of Urbino by Titian. So this is from 1538. This is an Italian Renaissance piece. And we see the female body, but it's kind of seductively arrayed. And her face, she's kind of inviting you to come closer with her eyes. This is not what we see here. Olympia has a very frontal gaze. She is not only looking at you, the viewer, she's confronting you, she's challenging you. And so this is incredibly offensive at the time. So I know I keep saying the same thing, but think about it. You're looking at, you've gone from a seductive, titillating image of a beautiful woman who invites your gaze, right? This concept of the male gaze, who invites it. Her fingers even curl very invitingly over her genitalia, over her vulva. Here we see Olympia has placed her hand almost protectively, covering her genitals. Okay, she is barring you from her genitals. And so this is not an image that is meant to be sexually exciting, that invites you in, that encourages you to think about the pleasures of having sex with a high class prostitute who probably does things that are not legal at the time. So oftentimes you'll have morality policing in that only certain sex positions are allowed, oral sex is illegal, etc. Okay, probably more than you needed to know. So this is something that everyone who sees it would know exactly what it is. And there's no way that they could be like, well, maybe it's just a pretty, no, they know that this is a prostitute. And this is very, very controversial. Okay, so I hope that you are kind of getting a feel for how different this is from what has come before. So this is not only like a pendulum swinging in terms of depicting antiquity and then landscapes, or in terms of just the style, but this is a very political statement. Okay, this is a depiction of the dead Christ being held by angels, by Monet as well. Okay, another woman being depicted. This is a portrait. So this is Berthe Morisot, who is an impressionist painter. She's very famous in her own right. And you can see how kind of sketchy it is. This is not polished. This is also not like the energetic, frenetic brushstrokes of someone like Frans Hals from the Dutch Baroque. This has a much more unfinished feel to it. But you can really sense that this is an individual. This is a specific person. Okay, so it's rough, etc. Again, just really trying to drive this home. This is another Bouguereau. Just look at the difference between the nudes as they're depicted in this very, very perfectly rounded, sensual uh, academic style. Okay, so this is Monet, this is the dead Toreador. So we're seeing drastic foreshortening, also the loose brush strokes. And this is kind of a grisly subject matter. So a Toreador is someone who would engage in bullfighting. And bullfighting is where you have a man who taunts a bull and the bull tries to kill him by goring him. And then the bullfighter tries to kill the bull by stabbing him to death. So let's see, we have Daumier, and let me see who else is left. Oh, I'm going to come back to Daumier because I have to go back to the beginning of this lecture in terms of images. I apologize. We also have Rosa Bonheur here, and Rosa is a female artist. So she is somewhat banned from painting figures. She cannot see nude figures. She's not allowed to see nude figures. And so she does the next best thing available to her. She studies not human anatomy, but animal anatomy. And so she becomes a painter of animals. And this is the Horse Fair from 1852 to 1855. And you can see that she has really done a lot of work to study the anatomy and the biology of these horses. And the musculature is incredibly accurate. And these animals are basically, these are animal portraits. Even though these are wild horses being brought into Paris to be auctioned off, many of them, they're rearing, they're terrified. Even though these are not horses that are famous that you need to know, these are individualized portraits. And so again, you can see this real dedication to a realistic depiction of these animals. And she's not constrained to just horses. She also does boars and sheep. And you can really see the amount of detail that she's put in here. And so sometimes realism manifests as very rough handling of paint that's somewhat abstracted, but sometimes it manifests as extreme attention to detail. But really it's the subject matter here that is important. And then lastly, I believe we have Winslow Homer, who is an American. Not lastly, actually. So he's an American and he depicts everyday life, everyday people. And so what we see here is a painting called Undertow from 1886. And these women have been pulled out to sea and they are being rescued. This is Veteran in a New Field, so 1865. This is just after the Civil War has ended. And what you see him holding here is a scythe. And this is what I was trying to explain for harvesting wheat. And so this is a very manual, physical job that he's doing. And so you see a veteran return from the Civil War, and he is harvesting the wheat, he's cutting it down. And so oftentimes when you see an image of death, death is carrying a scythe. Yeah, so we'll just, so you can kind of see that this is common, right? So here we have an image of death carrying this very aggressive scythe. Okay, so again, this emphasis on reality, the cotton pickers. So these are formerly enslaved or descendants of formerly enslaved people who are picking cotton, right? Their plight has not improved much after the Civil War because of efforts to keep them down, to keep African Americans out of society, to keep them poor. Okay, so just pictures of everyday life, it's quite common. We also have Eakins, who's another American artist, and this is the Gross Clinic from 1875. And what we see here is the surgeon, Dr. Samuel D. Gross, operating on someone who has been chloroformed. That's how they would knock people out before they had anesthesia. And you can see that he is lecturing to this hall of men who are studying medicine. And this woman is the mother of the man who's being operated on. And so what we're seeing here is not some pretty image, right? This is quite gory. There's blood stains everywhere. It's very realistic. You can see the distress in the mother here, okay? Compare it to something like this, where yes, we see the internal workings of a corpse, but we're not subjected to the gore of it. We do not see blood. We don't see nastiness, right? Look at them. They're wearing lace. They are wearing white lace while they operate, okay? This is not super realistic, all right? So again, another example of an operation that's being done, okay? Very realistic, individualized features. The wrestlers, so he was very big on depicting athletic competitions, particularly wrestling and boating and swimming, okay? And you can see that he has somewhat a loose style, and he does not idealize. So I'm going to end with Daumier. And the piece that I want to end on is not Gargantua, which we just saw, well, just at the beginning of this lecture. But the piece that I want to end on, so this is Gargantua, okay? The piece that I want to end on is Rue Transnonain, April 15th, 1834. And so Daumier is well known for his political cartoons. He does like the exaggerating stuff that is pretty common nowadays. And he does it for cartoons, but he also is capable of depicting people in very still realistic poses. And so what we see here is a print. And I believe this was published in a book, right? So this is the massacre that occurred at the Rue Transnonain, and Rue means road. And basically what happened was there was unrest, there were soldiers, and someone in this apartment building that was filled with peasants and factory workers, the poor, someone fired a shot at the soldiers, and they don't know who it is, they don't know where exactly it came from, except that it came from this building. And the soldiers storm the building and they slaughter everyone. And so what you're seeing here is the aftermath of that slaughter. You see an entire family of peasants slaughtered. You see the child here under his father. You see the foreshortened figure of the wife and a father here. And this is a very still picture, but it's very, very much a realist work. You see the unpleasant, gory aspects of what the government has inflicted on its people. You see the plight of the poor, okay? This is an incredibly moving piece. And it really epitomizes what is important to the realists. So I hope that this was educational. I realize that it's a very heavy topic, much of what's covered, but I hope that you really start to think about how this art has changed, how the artists have changed. So until next time.